Armageddon. The apocalypse. The end of the world. Predicted thousands of times, but in 1200 BC it actually happened, and no one saw it coming. Some of the greatest civilizations of the age were wiped out in a single generation.
Everything comes crashing down.
What happened at the end of the 13th century is still a mystery.
This was the disaster recorded in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey and in the books of Joshua and Judges in the Old Testament. But what caused this epic destruction?
Is it human? Is it Mother Nature?
It is a debate that has raged for decades. But new archaeological evidence found among ancient ruins on mountaintops may finally shed light on the source of this ancient cataclysm. For archaeologists, the past is illustrated by the objects left behind. The treasures of Tutankhamun's tomb, the toppled towers of mighty Greek palaces at Knossos, and pottery and stone reliefs that depict both vast riches and endless warfare. This was the ancient world of 1300 BC, the Bronze Age, named after the metallurgy of its weapons. Stretching from Egypt to the Black Sea, the ancient world was an amalgam of disparate and powerful nations, dominated by kings and their armies. The Mycenaeans and Minoans, the heroes of Homeric legend, built their palaces in Greece, Crete, and the Aegean Islands. The pharaoh Ramses, thought to be the pharaoh cited in the Old Testament, changed the very landscape with his monument at Karnak. The warring Hittites, biblical enemies of Egypt, dominated what is now Turkey and northern Syria, while the Canaanites, the merchants of the great trade route, controlled what was to become the Holy Land, Israel, Lebanon, and Jordan. It was a patchwork of many kingdoms, leagues apart, distinct in design and culture. Yet when archaeologists first began excavating this territory in the 1930s, a disturbing pattern began to emerge.
What we've got is a series of destructions. Most of the main cities, towns, palaces are destroyed for one reason or another.
Evidence of destruction was widespread, and in nearly every instance, the period of the collapse was the same, the years surrounding 1200 BC.
In this 50-year period, we've got at least 4 major civilizations that go down. Mycenaeans disappear, Minoans disappear, Hittites disappear, the Canaanites to a large extent disappear, and Egypt is so weakened that it's really never the same again. That's what's so amazing about this, is these are the biggest guys in the world, and they all bite the dust at about the same time, within a generation or two.
The Ramessid period starts off very strong with some of the most spectacular building and just incredible wealth. And then there are little cracks in the whole fabric of the society. Economically, religion, you can just see things sort of going downhill. In the reign of Ramses III, there's tremendous inflation. We see the monuments become smaller in scale. We also see huge economic problems with the tax base of the country, because so much of the taxable land had been removed from the tax rolls. Many people believe that from this time, the Egyptians no longer have the great self-confidence they had before the gods. We see a whole new genre of petitions to the gods, these prayers asking for, please God, help me, which we never saw before this time.
After a century of progress, which saw the development of the first alphabetic writing in Ugarit in 1300 and the first musical notation in Syria, the written record abruptly ended. What followed has become known, ominously, as the Dark Age.
The Dark Ages in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean have 2 connotations. One is, for the ancients, they lost most of the hallmarks of civilization. It's called that in part because civilization, as we know it, disappears for a couple of hundred years. They forget how to write, In Greece, they forget how to do large buildings, massive architecture, and it takes 200 or 300 years to come up out of this. But it's also a dark period for us.
Without written records, archaeologists were baffled by the evidence of mass migrations throughout the ancient world, all dating to around 1200 BC. On the island of Crete, tradesmen and merchants poured out of the coastal settlements and pushed inland to the mountainous lands worked by farmers and shepherds.
In the North Isthmus, the area right behind me here, it appears that there was almost no settlement at all, or perhaps a small scattering of small villages in the Mycenaean period. The population is very thin. By the 12th century, the population grows considerably. But where this population is coming from and why exactly is not entirely clear.
The destruction in the cities they left behind is mute testimony that this was no peaceful exodus.
It can be very difficult to determine the cause of a destruction. When you're digging, it's pretty obvious something's been destroyed. You've got fire, you've got ash, you've got burnt wood, you've got skeletons. But what actually caused the destruction?
The answer may not lie in the rubble of these palaces, but in the mountains high above them. One archaeologist has dedicated his life to following the clues, rediscovering the ancient pathways that lead up the sheer cliffs of the Aegean. It is here that he follows in the footsteps of the survivors, hoping at last to discover how and why their world collapsed. For decades, it remained a mystery. The sudden collapse of the great coastal cities and palaces of the ancient world in 1200 BC. What could have caused it? Most investigators dug for clues in the ruins of mighty cities. But the real evidence was to be found further inland, in the distant mountains and valleys of the Aegean islands, where humble farmers and shepherds once cultivated barley, lentils, and olives. It first came to light in the summer of 1983, when Polish archaeologist Krzysztof Nowicki, then a 26-year-old student, first climbed the mountain of Karfi on the island of Crete. Nowicki's original goal was to study a Neolithic religious shrine constructed on Karfi's summit by prehistoric peoples. But once there, 1,200 meters above sea level, Nowicki was drawn to another set of ruins. A mountaintop village that had been partially excavated and abandoned by the British archaeologist John Pendlebury in the 1930s. Having experienced one of the frigid winters on top of Karfi, Pendlebury concluded it was merely a temporary or seasonal settlement. But to Nowicki, the ruins made of large blocks of stone suggested something else.
What is interesting about the houses in Karfi, that they are pretty well constructed. This way of construction suggests that these people were prepared to live in this village for a long time, and that these were their permanent houses.
By mapping out and reconstructing the settlement from the excavated footprint, Nowicki confirmed his suspicion.
The excavation revealed at least 25 to 30 houses. At the moment, these remains are in a very bad state of preservation, but we still can trace the walls and we still can trace the rooms and particular individual houses. Karfi was a big village. It was not a small settlement. It was a village inhabited probably by 120 to 150 families, about 600 to 1,200 people.
The reconstructed village, 1,100 meters above sea level, seemed strangely out of place.
We should not expect a big village situated on this rock and on such altitude. Now We are sitting in the sun, there is probably 35 degrees. But if we came here in the winter, it is a very, very windy, very cold place. It is not very pleasant to live here.
Why would there be a permanent settlement so far above the usual sites on the lower hillsides and plains?
We have to ask why people move to these places, why people build their houses in the places difficult to climb up, why they decided to move their families to these houses, why they moved their entire economic system up to these places, to the high mountains.
Though Pendlebury had thought it an earlier site, Nowitzki's carbon dating of pottery and other artifacts placed it squarely in the time of the Bronze Age catastrophe, 1200 BC.
Before 1200 BC, we still have people living close to the sea, on the plains, in the valleys. Shortly before 1200 BC, we see that many of these low-situated places were either destroyed or abandoned.
The inevitable question was, what would force these populations to move from the coasts to the mountains? Nowitzki returned to the historical and archaeological record, but could find no consensus as to what had caused such sudden and dramatic changes.
There are all kinds of crazy theories out there to explain the end of the Late Bronze Age. Comets, volcanoes, aliens, you name it, people have said it.
But most hypotheses revolved around the ever-present threat of natural disaster.
One of the main suggestions has been drought, that there was a major drought across the entire Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean, and perhaps even up to Europe. And that starts tribes migrating. The level of the water of the Mediterranean had dropped significantly at the end of the Late Bronze Age.
Another possibility was the devastating earthquakes that regularly jolt the region.
We've got a number of sites in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean destroyed by earthquake within a 50-year span at the end of the Late Bronze Age. Mycenae is destroyed by earthquake. Troy 6 is destroyed by earthquake. Ugarit may be destroyed by an earthquake. Megiddo in Israel may be destroyed by an earthquake. The problem with saying that a single earthquake destroyed all of these sites and brought the Late Bronze Age to an end is that these sites are destroyed at different times during the 50-year period.
Though the timing of the earthquakes differs, they could still be related.
There is something that geophysicists today call an earthquake sequence or an earthquake storm, in which an earthquake will not relieve all of the stress in a fault, but will simply release part of the stress. And so the next part in the fault will go a year later, 10 years later, and then the fault unzips from east to west or west to east or north to south. And we eventually get what's called an earthquake sequence or an earthquake storm. And these last between 30 and 60 years. Many of the cities that are destroyed by earthquakes are either on a fault line or in a seismically active zone. In fact, if you lay a map of the sites that are destroyed at the end of the Late Bronze Age by earthquake on top of a map of seismically active zones, they will correlate on very nearly a one-to-one basis.
But the earthquake theory has always had its detractors.
People recover from earthquakes fairly quickly. That's pretty much proven. Even repeated earthquakes.
And to Nowitzki, no natural disaster could explain why a population should move to an even more precarious place.
There's no way that people would move their village 1100 meters to the top of this rock. Why? Escaping from the earthquakes and living on the edge of the rock? We don't see the people running away from natural disasters. So it makes no sense.
Nowitzki believes that these unlikely and inhospitable heights are a place of last resort, a defensible refuge designed to offer protection not from nature, but from a human enemy.
I mean, there is no reason to live on the ledges, hanging above the gorge or on the rocky knolls, other than a real threat from some other people.
If Nowitzki's theory about the Aegean apocalypse is correct, there should be dozens of refuge sites waiting to be discovered in the high mountains of Crete, hidden settlements unseen for generations. If he can find them, they could reveal details of a life and death struggle between the survivors who subsisted at these impossible heights and the enemy that drove them there. There are many theories as to what could have caused the apocalypse of 1200 BC and destroyed the mighty Bronze Age civilizations of the Hittites, Canaanites, Mycenaean, and Minoans. Some have blamed natural disasters, disease and pestilence, even the wrath of an angry god. But could it have had a human cause? And if so, who were the people that sent such mighty cultures crashing down within the span of a single generation? For decades, archaeologists sifted the abundant ruins but found only a few isolated clues. Then, in the 1930s, a stone tablet bearing a desperate message was unearthed in northern Syria. Found in the ruins of the palace of Ugarit, destroyed by fire around 1200 BC, it gave a foretaste of the destruction to come.
The king of Ugarit says, "My father, 7 enemy ships have been sighted. Now they've already done great damage to my country. If you see any more, please let me know." The tablet was never sent. It was found in the kiln, ready to be fired, when obviously the enemy ships came back and destroyed the town.
Who was this enemy that came from the sea? Only one culture, Egypt, survived the collapse of the Bronze Age to give them a name. Ancient hieroglyphics tell of a terrifying foe, the warriors known only as the Sea Peoples.
We get all of our details about what the Sea Peoples look like and their mode of transportation from the Egyptians. In addition to the texts that the Egyptians put up on their walls, they also put up pictorial scenes. And so they actually show us what the Sea Peoples look like. We can see the type of helmets they wear, the type of headdresses they wear. We can see them moving in ox carts, in some cases with their families, wives and children and possessions.
This was a mass movement that was affecting all the ancient cultures of the Eastern Mediterranean. And this was something that had never happened before. Every single culture in that area, even the ones as well established and as powerful as Egyptians, were being really shaken by this movement of the Sea People. Because part of it is they were coming not only to attack, but to settle.
This is what archaeologist Krzysztof Nowitzki had envisioned when he first looked at the ruins high on Kaffi, a desperate people, the shepherds and farmers of the valleys driven into the mountains they knew so well. But could he prove that Kaffi was no anomaly, simply one example in the systematic evacuation of an entire people? Nowitzki has spent more than 20 years putting his theory to the test. Traveling alone, and with only the most minimal of supplies, he methodically scaled mountain tops so steep that he often had to cling to the cliff face or find ancient footholds carved into the rock to counter the treacherous, shifting beds of loose shale. And it is here, at these improbable heights, that he found what has been his greatest discovery, the mountaintop settlement of Katalimata. The site can only be reached by ascending an incline of loose stone, then clinging to an almost invisible path along the cliff face. In 1990, American archaeologist Donald Haggis accompanied him as a witness.
This one is extraordinary The site itself is built on these sharply formed precipitous limestone cliffs above the plain, and you have to get to it by climbing a scree slope and then entering the gorge from the outer face by a narrow entrance path.
The artifacts found at the site reveal a people living on the edge. These simple country inlanders, shepherds and farmers by trade, would have had to move all their possessions one by one up these steep mountain trails. The old and the infirm would have had to have been carried, their dead buried in tombs carved out of the mountaintops. Livestock and crops in the valleys below could only be tended when conditions were safe enough.
The evidence that we recovered during surveys suggests that they were using the settlement probably for a considerable period. It's an uncomfortable site to live in. It's not conducive to settlement expansion.
Though life on Katalimata would have been extremely difficult, it had one advantage: security.
These places can be a nightmare for strangers, for foreigners. Without this knowledge of local topography, it's really very difficult to climb them and to find them.
They're like fortresses, in a sense, utilizing the natural terrain, and sometimes, as a lot of research out here is showing, not just utilizing the terrain, but utilizing fairly effective fortification walls as well.
Any enemy trying to invade the settlement would have been visible for miles, allowing the mountain people time to prepare. The invaders themselves would have been forced to approach single file, unable to hold their weapons while clinging to the cliff face.
Even if they found a way, then it was very easy to stop them. Even a few men could stop a much stronger group of intruders, of enemies here on these narrow ledges.
Katalimata was only the first of many refuge sites that Nowitzki has discovered. After scaling nearly 2,000 mountains in Crete, he has identified 80 different refuge sites dating to 1200 BC. One common unifying factor in the orientation and design of these settlements has convinced him that they were built to withstand the sea peoples.
How do we know that these people were afraid of the people coming from the sea and not that they were afraid of their neighbors? This can be done only by analyzing how these settlements were defended. Perfi is completely